The screaming never stopped. Not really. It moved through the palace like weather, like something with a will of its own, and everyone who lived beneath that roof had learned to feel it in their teeth. It came down through the stone. It came up through the floors. Two newborn princes wailing without end, their small voices raw and relentless in the east wing, and the whole kingdom seemed to hold its breath around the sound. They said the queen had run. They said she'd taken a lover and left the Alpha King shattered, left her sons motherless, left the heirs to the throne screaming for a woman who was never coming back. That was the story. That was what the servants whispered over the wash basins, quick and low, the way you whisper a thing you're half afraid is true. And every healer they brought was dismissed. Every nursemaid failed. The wet nurses came and went pale and shaking until there was no one left in the palace who hadn't tried, and no one left who dared to try again. Until a wolfless orphan girl put her hand on a screaming child's chest, and the screaming stopped. But we're not there yet, not quite. First you have to understand the girl. First you have to understand Elspeth. 12 years old, elbow deep in dishwater, gone the color of old meat in the lowest kitchen of the palace where the light never reached and the good servants never came. She scrubbed a copper pot until she could have seen her own face in it if she'd wanted to look, which she didn't. Because Chef wouldn't take it back until it shone. That was the rule. And Elspeth did not break rules. Rules were the one thing in her life that stayed the same. Around her the evening shift wound down in its usual roar. House servants swept through in fine livery silver platters balanced on their arms, and they heaved the scraped remains into her sink without so much as a glance her way. A wave of greasy water hit her square in the chest, fat and gristle, cold as a dead thing. She gasped, stumbled back a step, and she looked up. Some small, stubborn corner of her still expecting an apology, still expecting a person to turn and say sorry the way people did to other people. But the servant was already gone laughing at something over his shoulder, and the joke had nothing to do with her because nothing ever did. One day, she whispered to the pot in her hands, one day, they'll see what he saw in you. Who are you talking to? The voice cut across the kitchen, and Elspeth's stomach dropped clean through the floor. Petra. In the doorway, apron spotless chin up, 10 years old, and already certain of exactly what she was worth. 2 years younger than Elspeth. And it didn't matter because Petra had a wolf. That was the whole of it. That was the difference between them, and everyone in that kitchen knew it. No one, Elspeth said. Quick, eyes down. She scrubbed harder at a pot already clean. Don't react. Don't give them the thing they want. She knew this. She'd learned it the way you learn to cross ice one careful step at a time, and still. The apple core caught her on the temple, hard enough to blur her sight, hard enough that her hands jerked in the water, and the pot slipped and hit the bottom of the sink with a crash like a struck bell, and the kitchen laughed. Not just the children this time. The scullery maids turned to watch. Grown women who should have known better, laughing at a girl standing dripping in a dead man's grease. Out, Chef's voice boomed across the room. You're dripping on my floor. Clean yourself up and get out of my kitchen. Yes, Chef, Elspeth whispered, and she went. Down the corridor with the laughter chasing her heels all the way to the door of the little room that wasn't really a room. A storage cupboard once. Space enough for a straw mat and not much else. She pulled the door shut and stood in the dark and breathed. From somewhere far above, muffled by stone and distance, came the sound again. The crying, thin and wavering and impossible to unhear. It never truly stopped. Sometimes it faded enough that you could almost forget, and then it would surge back sharp as a blade sliding under a door. A reminder that something in this palace was broken and no one alive could fix it. Elspeth sank onto her mat, wrapped her arms around her knees, and did what she always did when the world got too heavy to hold. She thought of him. She'd been small, 5 years old. She'd wandered too deep into the palace gardens and lost herself among the hedges, and she'd stood there crying in the green shade, sure she'd never be found. And then he came, tall, broad through the shoulders. A man in worn hunting leathers, gray already threading his dark hair, and he knelt down in the grass beside her. And his voice, she still remembered his voice had been so gentle. "What's this?" he'd said. "A little lost lamb." He scooped her up like she weighed nothing, carried her against his chest all the way back to the kitchens, and she remembered how the cook's face had gone white as flour when she saw who was doing the carrying. She remembered the man saying something low, something about keeping her safe, about her being worth more than they knew. She hadn't understood it then. She barely remembered his face now. 7 years will do that to a memory, sand it down to a few bright grains. But she remembered the feeling. Held, safe, chosen. Somewhere along the years, in the telling and retelling of it to herself in the dark, the man had become the king. Who else would it be? Who else in a palace could reach down and lift a wolfless nothing out of the dirt and call her worth saving? It had to have been the king. She needed it to have been the king. "He saved you," she whispered into the dark. "He saved you once." It was proof. That was what it was. Proof she wasn't nothing no matter what they threw at her or called her. Because if a king could look at her and see something worth saving, then Petra was wrong and the maids were wrong and all of them were wrong and she was something. Her thoughts drifted the way they always did to the thing that had swallowed the whole palace whole. The queen was gone. The Alpha King's own mate had left him, left her newborn sons, left everything, and some said she'd run north with a lover into the dark. Elspeth's hands curled into fists. How could she? How could anyone look at those two helpless babies and just walk? Just leave them screaming? And the crying seemed to swell then, as if it had heard her, as if it agreed. "How could you?" she whispered to the walls. "How could you leave your babies?" No answer came. There never was one. There never is. Morning came the way it always did in that kitchen, gray light through a high window, the smell of yeast and smoke. And today it was Orsolia on the breakfast shift, which changed everything because Elspeth felt it the moment she stepped through the door. The other servants kept their distance. Orsolia had that effect. An older woman, gray at her temples, and she never raised her voice, not once in all the years Elspeth had known her. She simply had a way of looking at a person, a way that made you remember your manners, that made you stand up straight. "You're late," Orsolia said, not looking up from the dough. "Wash your hands." Elspeth washed her hands. A ball of dough waited on the board, and she sank her fingers into it and felt something in her chest come loose. Because the crying was fainter here. Because Orsolia was here. Because for a few minutes, the world was a place you could stand to live in. Two kitchen maids stood nearby pretending to chop and clearly doing nothing of the kind. "My sister works in the family wing," one murmured. "Says it's driving them all mad up there. The nursemaids take shifts now, 4 hours at a time because any longer and they start weeping too." "No mother to soothe them," the other said. "What do they expect?" "Enough," Orsolia said. Quiet. And it was enough. They went silent. Then the door slammed open. A woman stumbled through it, a nursemaid by her uniform cap knocked sideways, face the color of ash. "Orsolia!" She gasped the name. "Orsolia, please. You have to help me." Orsolia set down her dough, wiped her hands slow and careful on her apron. "Breathe, Tamsin." But Tamsin couldn't breathe. That much was plain. "The princes." The words came apart in her mouth. "They won't stop. We've tried everything. Everything. 4 weeks now since the queen left and they won't." "Quiet." Orsolia's hand came down on the woman's shoulder like an anchor. "What do you need?" "You're still nursing." Tamsin clutched at her sleeve. "Aren't you? The wet nurses have all failed. Every one. And the king is furious. He's threatening to dismiss the whole staff if we can't please. We need someone. Anyone. We need someone to try." And Orsolia's jaw went tight, and Elspeth watched something move behind the old woman's eyes, some weariness older than the walls. "I'll come," Orsolia said. And that was when the cold thing settled in Elspeth's stomach. Because Orsolia would leave. And when Orsolia left, Elspeth was alone again, in a kitchen full of people who looked straight through her, and the morning would go back to being what it always was. The words were out before she could stop them. "Can I come?" Orsolia turned, one eyebrow up. "What?" "Can I come with you? I can help." Talking fast, now too fast, the way you do when you already know the answer. I can carry things. Cloths, water, whatever the babies need, I won't get in the way. She can carry my supplies, Tamsin said. But we have to go. Please, now. Orsolia looked at her a long moment, long enough that Elspeth's heart began the slow climb into her throat. Fine, the old woman said at last, but you stay quiet, and you don't touch anything unless I tell you to. They went at a near run. Through the servants' corridors, up 3 flights of stairs into a part of the palace Elspeth had never seen. The halls widened. The floor turned from rough stone to polished marble that threw the lamplight back up at her face. She should have been staring, drinking in every gilded thing. But she wasn't. Because with every step toward the nursery, the crying grew louder. And it wasn't the crying of a hungry child. It was raw and bottomless and inconsolable, and it crawled up under her skin and settled into her bones, and by the time they reached the door, her hands were shaking. Tamsin pushed it open. The room was beautiful. Dark carved wood silk draped soft over everything a prince could want. And in the center of it, 2 cradles. And in the cradles, 2 tiny bodies writhing, screaming, small fists beating the air. 3 nursemaids huddled by the window faces hollowed out the faces of people who hadn't slept in a month. They've been fed, one said. Flat, changed, burped, rocked, nothing works. 4 hours, said another, eyes red-rimmed. Then someone else takes over. Any longer and you hear them even when they've gone quiet. You hear them in your sleep. Orsolia moved to the nearest cradle without a word, lifted the child's small red-faced his whole body, one clenched fist of grief, and settled him against her chest and swayed. "Hush," she murmured. "Hush now, little prince." He screamed louder. She tried to nurse him. He turned his face away, wailing. She rocked. She sang low and steady, the voice of a woman who gentled 100 crying children. And nothing. In the second cradle, his brother shrieked back at him, the 2 of them locked in a terrible duet with no end. And Elspeth's feet moved without asking her. She crossed the room in a kind of daze. She wasn't deciding to. Her body simply went the way water goes downhill, and she reached the second cradle and looked down at the tiny, furious creature inside his whole small self, shaking with the force of his own crying. She reached in. She laid her hand flat on his heaving chest, and he went still. His eyes flew open, wide, dark, startled. He stared up at her as if he'd never seen another living face in all his short and terrible life, and the room went so quiet she could hear her own heart. She didn't think. She opened her mouth and sang. It was the lullaby Orsolia had sung to her years and years ago when she was small enough to be sung to. The only song she knew all the way through. Her voice came out thin and unpracticed and cracked in the middle, and the baby's breathing slowed. His fist uncurled, reached up, closed around one of her fingers, and behind her in the other cradle the second twin stopped crying too. The silence that came down over that nursery was total, enormous. The kind of silence with a shape and a weight to it, and every soul in the room felt it, and no one moved because no one wanted to be the one who broke it. "How?" Tamsin breathed, and couldn't finish. Because for the first time in 4 weeks, the royal nursery was still. Elspeth couldn't look away from them, from the one holding her finger, from the long lashes on his brother's cheeks in the other cradle. They wanted her. She could feel it warm as firelight, and something clenched tight in her chest. Her whole life came slowly, carefully open. These small, royal, precious things. They chose her, the wolfless one, the nothing one, the one they threw grease at and looked straight through. For the first time since a stranger carried her out of a garden, Elspeth felt chosen. "Can you bring her back?" Tamsin said to Orsolia, barely above a breath. "Tomorrow, please." And Orsolia's eyes were fixed on Elspeth, and her face. Elspeth couldn't read her face at all. "Yes," she said finally. "We'll come back." And then a year went by like water through cupped hands. A year of following Orsolia through the servants' passages 3 times a day. A year of slipping into the royal nursery like a secret nobody was meant to keep. Orsolia and Tamsin guarded it as best they could, swore the other nursemaids to silence, but a thing like that can't stay hidden forever. And after a year, the whispers followed Elspeth wherever she went. The king himself couldn't calm them, one servant said, but a wolfless kitchen girl can. I heard they scream the moment she leaves the room, said his friend. Unnatural is what it is. No one could explain it. Why two royal princes, sons of the Alpha King, would settle only for a nobody. A girl born without the one thing that made a person in this place. But Elspeth didn't care about the whispers. Let them whisper. The man who saved her had given her a place under this roof when he could have turned her out, and now his sons needed her. Chose her. She had Callan and Doran, and Callan and Doran had her, and the rest of the palace could choke on its gossip. The morning sun was just cresting the eastern towers when she and Orsolia slipped in. And the moment the door opened, two small heads popped up over the rail of the crib they shared. Callan saw her first. His whole face lit like a struck match, and he loosed a shriek of pure joy, bouncing, slapping his fat little hands against the rail. Doran joined a heartbeat later, babbling, reaching, and Elspeth's heart swelled so fast it hurt. "Good morning, my little terrors," she said, and crossed the room and leaned over the rail to press a kiss to each round head. Callan first, then Doran, always in that order. They'd have wept if she got it wrong. Callan grabbed a fistful of her hair. Doran tried to climb clean over the rail to get at her, and the second she had them both in her arms, they went soft and heavy and content, like something that had been holding its breath, finally letting it go. Behind her, Orsolia made a small sound. Fond. And under the fondness troubled, deeply quietly troubled. Elspeth set the boys on the thick rug and started the morning's work. Wiping faces, wrestling wriggling bodies into fresh tunics. Singing the whole time low and steady, while they babbled back at her in their own language and sounds that almost had words in them. This was her favorite part of being alive. When she finally caught them both and pulled them into her lap, they came willing, folding against her like puppies looking for warmth, and within minutes their eyes went heavy. She held them close, hummed, rocked just slightly, and their whole world narrowed to the circle of her arms, and she thought, he must know by now. Surely he knows. Maybe he'll come and see for himself. Walk in and find his sons calm and sleeping in the arms of the girl he saved and understand. Remember the garden. Smile at her the way he did that day and say she was meant for this, meant to be here, meant to matter. We need to talk, Orsolia said quietly. They stepped into the corridor, left the door cracked so Elspeth could hear the boys breathe. You've grown too familiar with those children, Orsolia said. You're forgetting your place. I know my place. Sharper than she meant. It's here, with them, because they need me. No one else can do what I do. I know that. And the old woman's voice was gentle, which was worse than if she'd shouted. I know it better than anyone, but it doesn't change what you are, child, or what they are. She took Elspeth by both shoulders. You are a servant. They are princes. And if the king ever sees how deep this runs, there will be a price. And you will be the one who pays it. Elspeth pulled away. His Majesty would be glad his sons are loved. He's a good man. He saved me once. He'd understand. Elspeth. A warning all the way through the name. They need me. Maybe this is why he saved me. Maybe this was always what I was for. Orsolia looked at her a long moment. And in the old woman's face was something that looked terribly like grief. You think he'll welcome you, she said. Give you a place of honor at his table. She shook her head slow. Those pups will grow child. They'll grow and they'll become what they were born to be. And where does that leave you, heartbroken? Cast aside. Or worse. You don't know that. You are a servant, Elspeth. Flat now. Final. Never forget it. And she turned and walked back into the nursery and left Elspeth alone in the marble hall. But Elspeth couldn't make herself believe it. Wouldn't. Because deep down in a place she showed no one she'd been keeping a dream warm all this time. She wanted the king to find them, wanted him to see her with his sons, see how much they loved her so that he would love her too, the way she'd been certain ever since the garden that somewhere under all that gold, he already did. He'd saved her once. Surely he would understand. 3 weeks later, it was an ordinary morning. She'd dressed the boys in matching tunics, and they'd promptly undone every bit of it by crawling off the moment she set them down. "Kaelin, come back here." He squealed and crawled faster. She lunged. He shrieked with laughter. And Doran, seeing his brother caught, came barreling across the rug at top speed, both arms flung out toward her. "Got you!" Breathless, laughing now, too. "Got you, my little monsters!" The double doors slammed open, and the laughter died in Elspeth's throat. The Alpha King stood in the doorway. She had built him golden in her mind for 7 years. The man in front of her was something else entirely. Tall, yes. Powerful, yes. But his eyes were fixed on her, and in them was a rage so total, a revulsion so deep that Elspeth felt her stomach drop straight through the marble floor. The twins went still. They felt it. They always felt what she felt. "Let my children go," the king said, very quiet. And the quiet was the most frightening thing she had ever heard. He moved so fast she had no time to run. He crossed the room in 3 strides and seized one of the cradles and hurled it across the nursery, and it hit the far wall and burst apart, splinters of dark wood raining over the silk, and the boys screamed. They clung to her, small fingers digging in with a desperate strength, bodies shaking against her cries gone high and terrified. Callan buried his face in her neck. Doran's nails bit into her arm hard enough to draw blood, and she barely felt it because she was staring at the king in a horror so complete it had emptied her out. Why? Why was he like this? Was he ill? Was he under some spell? This couldn't be him. This couldn't be the man from the garden. The doors banged again, and Orsolia and Tamsin came rushing in, and the king rounded on them. "Why?" he roared, and the words shook the walls. "Does this servant child have her filthy hands all over my sons?" The boys were sobbing now, gasping, their whole small bodies heaving. And Elspeth barely heard them, because this was wrong, all of it was wrong, and some stubborn broken part of her still could not make it fit. She pushed herself up on shaking legs, the twins still clinging. "Your Majesty," a thread of a voice. "Please, try to understand. Your sons, they need me." His attention snapped back to her, and the look in his eyes was cold and vicious, and empty of every scrap of warmth she'd built her whole life around, and it froze the blood in her veins. "Need you." Softer now. Softer than the shouting, and so much worse. "Why," he said, "would the heirs to my throne need you?" He took a step toward her. She backed away without meaning to. "You are nothing, a servant, and a wolfless one at that." Each word a dropped stone. "So get your filthy hands off my sons." Orsolia and Tamsin broke out of their fear all at once. "Sire." Orsolia's voice was steady, careful, the voice she used on frightened animals. "The girl does have an affinity with the children. I'll see she remembers her place. Perhaps if we simply get her out of my sight." His scent flooded the room then. Sour and burning and huge, the scent of an alpha in full fury, and it was hard to breathe, hard to stand. "If I see her look at my boys again," he said, "I'll have her whipped in the courtyard and thrown from the palace to die in the woods like the worthless thing she is." And Elspeth's knees gave out beneath her. She went down onto the marble, the twins still locked around her, and the sound that tore out of her was not a human sound. It was raw. It was animal. "No," she gasped. "Please, please, I'll only come at night, Elspeth." Orsolia's hand closed on her elbow. "Come now, come." Tamsin took her other arm, and the 2 women pulled, but Elspeth's legs would not hold, and she stayed there on the cold floor, while the king strode forward and grabbed his sons by their little collars and wrenched them out of her arms. He pulled so hard that Kaelin nearly fell, and the boys screamed, high and thin and terrified, a sound that went through Elspeth like a blade drawn slow, and they fought him, thrashing arms stretched out toward her, crying so hard they couldn't catch their breath. "Please." She reached for them with everything she had, but Orsolia and Tamsin had her now, dragging her backward, back and back toward the door. And then the doors closed, and the crying went muffled, distant. But it did not stop. They got her down to her cupboard somehow. She didn't remember the stairs. She curled onto her side on the thin straw mat and pulled her knees to her chest and sobbed into her own 2 hands. and distantly she felt Orsolia's rough palms smoothing her hair. "I tried to warn you, child," the old woman said. "So soft, so sad. They were never yours." The words should have cut, should have gone straight to the bone, but Elspeth couldn't take them in. "I don't," she wept. "I don't understand. I was helping them. I made them happy. They were happy." "Elspeth, it's because the Queen left. That's what it is. He saw me with them and it reminded him of her. That has to be why." The words spilling faster now past any wall she could build. "He's a good man, Orsolia. You know he is. He gave me a home. He wouldn't hurt me on purpose. So if I wait until he's not so angry, until he's calmer, I can explain it properly, and he'll remember the garden, and he'll let me see them again." "No." Orsolia's voice was firm now, almost harsh. "No, child. He won't. But he has to." Elspeth sat up all at once, her face streaming, her whole body shaking. "The twins need me. Did you hear them? Did you hear how scared they were? Right now, in that beautiful room, 2 babies are crying for me, and I'm not allowed to go to them." And she dissolved. And Orsolia gathered her in and held her while she came apart there in the dark of a cupboard that wasn't a room in the lowest corner of a palace that had never once been hers. But even then, even shattered on the floor with the truth breaking over her in waves, Elspeth was already telling herself there had to be a way to fix it. There had to be. Because she could not yet let herself believe the alternative. That the man from the garden and the man in the nursery might be the same man, and that neither one had ever for one moment been kind. Above her, through stone and distance, the crying went on. And it would be a long time yet before Elspeth understood the truth of it. That the man who saved her had never been who she thought. That the crying had a reason. That the 2 small princes had reached for her out of every soul in that palace for a cause that ran deeper than affection, deeper than scent, all the way down to blood. But that comes later. For now there was only a girl on a straw mat, holding herself together with both arms, and somewhere far above 2 children screaming her name in the only language they had. 3 days. That was how long it took the palace to teach Elspeth what silence really meant. Because the twins' screaming had become part of the building by now, woven into the walls, the way damp gets into stone, and everyone else had learned to live around it. But not Elspeth. Elspeth heard it in her sleep, heard it while she scrubbed, heard it in the space between one breath and the next, 2 small voices calling for her from 3 floors up, and she was not allowed to answer. She stood at the wash basin, hands raw and wrinkled in the cold, and behind her, the scullery maids whispered, "Why doesn't she just go up to them?" Shh, because they didn't know. That was the mercy of it. Orsolia and Tamsin had kept the worst of it quiet, so the rest of the kitchen knew only that the wolfless girl had cared for the princes and was now forbidden. They didn't know about the shattered cradle, the rage, the word he'd used. Her hands went still in the water, because it didn't fit. 3 days on, and it still would not fit. The king had looked at her like something scraped off his boot, and all she'd done was love his children. There had to be a reason. Some piece she was missing. Grief for the queen. Some fury that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with being in the wrong room at the wrong Elspeth. Chef's voice cut clean through the spiral. "That pot's clean. Next one." "Yes, chef," she whispered. And she was just turning toward the corridor when the kitchen door burst open. A footman half fell through it, breathless, wild-eyed. "Have you heard?" he gasped. "Word from the north. The Queen, Queen Iseline, she lives." The kitchen stopped. "She's raised an army," the footman said. "She's declared war. She's coming to take back her sons." And the room exploded into noise, shouting questions, the crash of a dropped pan, and through all of it Elspeth stood very still, and it seemed to her that the crying 3 floors up climbed higher, sharper, as if the babies knew, as if their blood had told them their mother was on the road. "King Valor has named her a traitor," the footman went on. "The whole palace is on lockdown. No one in or out until further notice." The murmurs died. The weight of it came down over the kitchen like a wet cloak. They were trapped, every one of them. trapped in a palace under siege with two inconsolable babies whose mother was coming to claim them by force. Elspeth lay on her mat that night in a dark she couldn't see through, and she thought about Callan and Doran. Was anyone holding them? Was anyone with them at all? Or were they lying in that hastily built new crib, exhausted past screaming, crying themselves hoarse in an empty room, the way she'd cried herself hoarse in this one? I could go to them, she thought, just for a little while. And she sat up, slow, her heart already starting to pound, because she knew what she was thinking, and knew what it might cost, and she thought it anyway. Her feet were moving before she'd finished deciding. The family wing was dim. A single lamp burned in the nursery, and the crying hit her the moment she cracked the door louder. Here, rawer, more desperate than anything she'd heard in 3 days. The twins were in the new crib, cheap wood, hastily nailed, nothing like the fine one the king had smashed. And the second they saw her, they threw themselves at the bars, reaching both hands, faces red and streaming and slack with a relief so total it broke something in her chest. They'd been left alone, no nursemaid, no one to hold them, no one to sit with them while they came apart. Oh, she breathed. Oh, little ones. She gathered them up heavier now than a year ago, solid and warm and shaking, and they pressed their wet faces into her neck and made small broken sounds, somehow worse than the screaming. Hush, she whispered. Hush now, I've got you. And they stopped. They sagged against her, all the fight going out of them at once, and within a minute their breathing had evened, and they were asleep. Truly asleep. Deep asleep for the first time in who knew how long. She held them, and her own tears ran silent, and she knew she should go. She'd done what she came to do. She should set them down and slip back to her cupboard before I warned you. Elspeth spun. King Valor stood in the doorway, 2 guards at his shoulders. And his rage this time wasn't the explosion it had been. It was cold, controlled, which was so much worse. Please, she said. You can see it. You can see I help them. Take her. Hands seized her arms. Other hands tore the twins from her, and the boys woke wailing confused, reaching for her over a guard's shoulder as they dragged her toward the door. Please. She twisted, trying to see them one last time. Please, I only wanted... And then she was in the corridor, and the door was closing, and the crying was on the wrong side of it. The dungeon was cold, and it smelled of mold and old fear. They threw her into a cell without ceremony, and a guard looked at her through the bars, a 12-year-old girl with grease still on her apron, and set it flat like he was reading off a list. King's order, you hang at dawn, for treason. A sound came out of her. She didn't know what it was, because she was 12, because she had only ever wanted to help, to love, to be loved back just once. And how was that treason? How was any of it treason? She crawled to the corner and curled onto her side, small as she could make herself. And the truth came for her at last, in that cold dark, the truth she'd spent 7 years refusing. The man from the garden was never coming, because he had never been the king, or if he had, the king had never been kind. Either way, the dream was ash, and she had built her whole self on it, and now it was gone, and she was going to die, and there was no one left in the wide world who would even notice. And that was when she heard it. Not padding at first. A scratch, a snuffle, something small working at the base of the corridor door, and then the door which some careless guard had left unlatched in the chaos of a palace at war swung a hand's width open, and 2 shapes squeezed through the gap. Elspeth's breath stopped clean in her chest. Wolf pups. Tiny, fluffy, stumbling on legs too big for them, dark-furred, no bigger than house cats. And she knew them. She'd have known them anywhere. Cullen, she whispered. Doran, what happened to you? The pups saw her face, and their snuffling turned to a frenzy of joy, and they tumbled over each other across the stone to reach the bars. Kalen shoved his nose through and licked at her fingers. Doran tried to wedge his entire head through the gap, got stuck, and kept trying anyway, and a tear tracked down her cheek because she understood all at once what she was seeing. They'd shifted, at 14 months old. Children didn't shift. Not this young, not close. Everyone knew a pup didn't take his wolf until 8 or 9 years of age, and the earliest anyone had ever so much as whispered of was 4, and these two weren't yet a year and a half. You were scared, she breathed. So scared it just came out of you. And you followed my scent all the way down here. Doran got his whole plump middle wedged in the bar's back legs, paddling uselessly at the air, and despite the cold and the dark and the dawn coming for her, a wet, cracked laugh escaped her. You ridiculous things, both of you. And then she saw it. Across the corridor on the wall, a heavy iron ring of keys hung on a peg the guard had walked away from. Too high for a pup, too far for her arm through the bars. And useless, all of it useless unless her eyes went to Doran still stuck in the bars. All right, she whispered, and her mind was racing now. All right, listen to me, both of you. Because she'd spent a year learning exactly how these two thought. She knew what they chased. She knew what they couldn't resist. She worked her thin arm through the bars, tugged a loose thread from the hem of her sleeve, unraveled a long, trailing string of it, and she flicked the end of it toward the peg on the wall. Kellen's head snapped around, a moving string, the single most fascinating thing in the history of the world. Get it, Elspeth whispered. Go on, get it. He pounced, missed, pounced again, and his small body slammed into the wall beneath the peg, and the peg shivered, and the ring of keys swung on its nail, but held. Again, she breathed. Again, my love, and my... Doran popped free of the bars at last, and joined the hunt, and now there were two of them flinging themselves at the dancing thread careening off the wall, and on the third crash, the whole peg jumped loose of the stone, and the ring of keys came down with a great ringing clatter. Both pups shot straight up in the air, startled half out of their skins. Then, being pups, they decided this loud, shiny new thing was the most wonderful thing that had ever happened, and fell upon it. Except now she needed the keys over here and they were over there. Bring it, she pleaded, jingling the thread against the bars. Bring me the shiny. Bring it here. Kalen got his jaw around the ring. Too heavy. Dropped it. Tried again, dragging it a whole 2 inches before it slipped. Doran seized the other side and hauled the opposite direction purely on principle, and the two of them fought a screeching, sideways, pointless war over the ring of keys that carried it by pure blind luck, by the grace of two babies who could not agree on anything closer and closer and closer to her cell. One last enormous tug from Kalen. Doran's teeth slipped. He tumbled backward into the bars, and the ring skittered the final hand's breadth into reach. Elspeth's hand shot through and closed around cold iron. Good boys, she wept. Oh, you wonderful, silly, perfect boys. The pups sat down, tongues out, immensely pleased with themselves. Her hands shook so hard she could barely work the ring. First key, no. Second, no. The pups, losing all interest now that the shiny had stopped moving, began to groom each other. Third, fourth, fifth. The sixth key slid home with a soft click. She turned it. The door swung open. She dropped to her knees and they swarmed her, climbing into her lap, licking her face, and she gathered both squirming bodies against her chest. You came for me, she whispered. You came for me. And then she ran. Up through the dungeon corridors, following the torchlight, the pups heavy and warm in her arms. She shouldered through the kitchen door and stopped dead. Orsolia stood at the work table, a knife in her hand. Elspeth. Barely a breath. Her eyes dropped to the pups, and whatever she'd been about to say died in her throat. She set the knife down. We have to get you out, she said, already moving, already reaching for a canvas pack, already filling it breadcloths, a water skin, a small blade. And those pups have to go to their mother. She spread a map across the table, traced a line north with one blunt finger. I'm loyal to Queen Wyceline, she said low and fierce. Always have been. She's gathering her forces here, in the Northern Territories. Her finger stopped. The king is a dangerous man, child. He'll hurt you. He'll hurt his own sons. But the queen shall protect you. Take them and go north. Elspeth's eyes filled. I'm scared. Please, come with me. And Orsolia's face, that stern, gray, unbreakable face, cracked straight down the middle. I can't, she said. Someone has to stay. Lead them off your scent. Buy you time. She pressed the map into Elspeth's hands and settled the pack onto her thin shoulders. But you have to go now, this minute. Somewhere above, a warning bell began to ring. Orsolia pulled her into an embrace so hard it drove the breath out of her. Go, she said against Elspeth's hair. Be safe. You're my only family. Every word came apart. Orsolia, you're all I have. I love you. The old woman's eyes glistened. She scrubbed a tear away rough with the back of her wrist. Then she gripped Elspeth's arm and hauled her to the corner of the kitchen and dragged aside a heavy rug, and there beneath it was a trapdoor in the floor. There's a passage. It comes out past the walls. She heaved it open on darkness. Head northwest into the forest, and don't stop. Whatever you hear behind you, you don't stop. Boots in the corridor now, voices shouting. Thank you, Elspeth whispered, for everything. Go, child. She climbed down into the dark, and the last thing she saw before the trapdoor came down was Orsolia's face watching her go. Then black. Then she was alone with two wolf pups, and a passage that smelled of earth and cold, and she stood there a moment gathering herself. All right, she whispered to them. Northwest, to your mother, to the queen. And she walked into the dark. The forest. When the passage finally spat her out into it, was blacker than the tunnel had been, and already she was carrying two things too heavy for her, the pups and the guilt. Because Orsolia was back there, the only soul who had ever truly loved her, left standing in that kitchen with a knife and a war coming. She knew why. She knew there'd been no other way. And the knowing lifted not 1 ounce of it off her chest. But she couldn't stop, so she didn't. The pups were heavier than she'd guessed. Solid, shifting, restless weight, and the pack dug into her shoulders with every step, and still she pushed on deeper into the trees until the canopy closed overhead, and she finally let herself slow. She fumbled for the map. Northwest. Orsolia had said northwest, but the trees had swallowed the sky and the moon was gone, and which way was a howl. Distant, unmistakable. Tracker wolves. The map crumpled in her fist as she shoved it away. No time. No time to read it. She ran. The pups whimpered as she took off, crashing through the undergrowth branches, tearing at her arms, and behind her the howls climbed and multiplied, and now there were men's voices too, threaded through the wolf song. Faster, she gasped to herself. Come on, faster. Except her legs were already failing. Her knees shook with every stride. And without the map, without any sense of which way was safety, she knew cold and clear, even as she ran, that she was only getting more lost. Amber eyes gleamed through the trees ahead. She veered hard left, tore through a thicket that ripped at her clothes, and the pups yelped. Shh, she begged. Please, shh. But they were frightened now, and they couldn't help it, and their small, terrified sounds seemed impossibly loud in the dark. The snarls closed in. The thud of paws grew nearer until her foot caught a root and she went down. She threw herself behind a massive oak and sank to the forest floor. And this was it. This was as far as she could go. Her body simply would not do any more. Shh, little terrors, she whispered, and the words shook to pieces. Shh. But they couldn't. They were babies. Exhausted and frightened past bearing, and they whimpered against her, while the amber eyes drew in on every side, 3 of them. 4, the tracker wolves circling the oak, low growls rolling out of the dark. Elspeth pressed her back to the rough bark and understood that she was going to die here. Not at dawn. Now. And the pups' whimpers rose because they were only babies, and they could not help it. Then something enormous moved through the undergrowth. The tracker nearest her turned toward it, and a wolf unlike anything Elspeth had ever seen exploded out of the black. He was huge, easily twice the size of the palace trackers, a scarred muzzle, and he slammed into the first wolf with force enough to send it flying into a tree with a sickening crunch. Another tracker leapt onto his back. He shook it off like water. The fight was savage, merciless, over almost before it began. And then palace guards came crashing through the trees, swords drawn. Rogue wolf, kill it! The great scarred wolf reared and loosed a howl that seemed to shake the trees down to their roots, and the guards stumbled back, swords wavering. He dropped to all fours and charged, and they scattered, crashing away into the dark. Then silence. The trackers dead or fled, the guards gone, and the massive wolf turned, and his eyes pale gold in what little light there was found hers. He took one step toward her, and Elspeth bolted. She didn't think. She grabbed the pups and ran, and behind her she heard a surprised huff, almost absurdly like a laugh, and then the soft, heavy pad of paws giving chase. He was faster. Of course he was faster. But he wasn't attacking. He was just following, keeping pace easy as breathing while she stumbled and gasped through the trees. She spotted a cluster of boulders and dove for a gap between them, wedging herself in the pups crushed to her chest. The space was barely big enough. She squeezed in anyway. And for a long moment, nothing. Silence. Then the sound of bones. The wet, cracking, folding sound of a shift. Elspeth pressed her hand hard over her own mouth. The pups spent at last had gone quiet. "Well," said a deep voice close by, dry, faintly amused. "That's a new way to thank a man for saving your life." She said nothing. "Those palace wolves were about to tear you into ribbons, kid." Rustling, fabric. I was getting dressed. Can't say I've ever been run from quite so enthusiastically, right after a rescue and everything. Nothing. She held her breath, a long sigh. "All right then, let's see." Footsteps circled her hiding place, once, twice, then stopped right in front of the gap, and a man's face appeared in the opening 40's long, unkempt hair streaked with gray and eyes still that pale wolf gold even in a human face. Sharp. And under the sharpness buried deep beneath a great deal of weariness, something that might almost have been kindness. "There you are," he said mildly. "What are you doing wedged in there? Can't be comfortable." She stared at him, trembling. He studied her, and his face softened by a degree. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said. "I just pulled a pack of trackers off you. Remember, if I wanted you dead, I'd have saved the trouble and let them." Her voice came out a croak. "You killed them. Some of them. No apology in it. They were hunting a child carrying babies through the dark." His jaw tightened. "I don't take kindly to that." Her arms closed tighter around the pups. He noticed, and huffed that soft laugh again. "Easy, Mother Wolf. I'm not going to take them." He lowered himself to the ground a few feet off, slow and threatening. "Name's Corvin. What's yours?" She didn't answer. "That's all right," he said and shrugged. "But you ought to come out. Those guards will regroup soon enough. They always do." "How do I know?" she managed. "You won't take me back to the palace." And every trace of amusement went out of his face. "Because," he said low and even and absolutely certain, "I'd sooner cut off my own arm than help that king with anything at all." And the venom in it was real. Not a performance. Not a trick to coax her out. Old personal hate, the kind you can't fake and can't hide. So slowly, so carefully, an inch at a time, Elspeth edged out of the gap between the stones. Because she had nowhere else in the world to go. Because Dawn was somewhere behind her with a rope in its hands. Because 2 babies slept in her arms and needed a mother 3 days' hard walk to the north. And because God help her after everything, after the garden and the man who never came, and the word nothing spoken. In a voice she'd once have died for, some stubborn, unkillable part of Elspeth still wanted more than anything to believe a stranger in the dark might turn out to be kind. She looked up at his scarred face and his tired gold eyes. "Elspeth," she whispered. And Corvin went very still, because he'd caught something then, some thread of scent on the night air. His brow drew down, and for just a moment he looked at this half-starved, wolfless girl, clutching 2 royal pups, as though he'd seen her somewhere before, a long time ago, in another life. He didn't say it, not yet. But something behind his eyes had come open, and it did not close again. They walked north and Corvin never left, which surprised no one more than Corvin, because he'd said the river crossing. "Said it plain, I'll walk you as far as the river and then, kid, you're on your own." And then the river came fast and white over the rocks, and he frowned at it and said the water was too high, they'd have to go upstream. Another few hours. Those hours became a day. That day became another. "There's a village near here," he announced on the 3rd morning, barely slowing. "Royal sympathizers. We go around." And that was 2 more days. By the end of the first week, Corvin still hadn't left, and Elspeth had stopped asking why. She simply let herself believe it, that he was staying, that for now this scarred and weary stranger with the pale gold eyes was theirs. The days fell into something close to peace. He taught her to set snares, taught her which berries filled a belly and which emptied it fast and painful. And at night they slept in a shape that felt somehow sacred. Corvin stretched out in his great wolf form, Elspeth's back against his warm flank, the two pups curled tight against her stomach. A small, strange family made of leftovers, made of the ones nobody else had wanted. One morning she watched in horror as Kalen discovered a rabbit snare. He crept up on it, crouched, pounced, and the snare collapsed on him, and the little pup found himself trussed in cord and sticks, yelping, thrashing. Doran rushed to the rescue and promptly tangled himself too, and within seconds, both princes were a single furious rolling ball of fur and rope. Elspeth ran for them. But Corvin was already there, kneeling in the leaves with a patience she'd never have guessed at his big scarred hands working gentle through the knots. "Easy little warriors," he murmured, freeing one then the other. "You've defeated the fearsome rope. Very brave, very fierce." Kalen shook himself, deeply offended, and immediately attacked what was left of the snare all over again. Corvin's mouth twitched. He glanced up at the laugh she was fighting to hold in. "They're going to destroy every trap I set, aren't they?" "Probably." He sighed like a man carrying a great burden, and went to build another one. That night, after the twins had gone down, he fed a stick into the fire and watched the sparks climb. "We'll reach the foothills tomorrow," he said. "After that, 3 more days to the Northern Territories, maybe 4. And her heart sank because she knew what came after the arithmetic. "And then you'll leave," she said. He didn't answer right away, poked at the fire, sent up another spiral of light. "I left the king's pack," he said finally low, "when he banished my brother." She went still. "My brother took a wound in one of Valor's wars. It never healed right. Couldn't shift properly after that. His wolf came out wrong, half-formed in pain." He shook his head slow. "The king said he was weak, said a broken wolf was no wolf at all, and he cast him out." The fire snapped between them. "I should have gone with him that day, but I didn't. Told myself I was a man of honor, that my place was with my pack." His jaw worked. "A few weeks later I found my brother dead in a ditch, alone." He looked up and the firelight caught the gold of his eyes and made them fierce. "The king throws away anyone he decides is worthless," he said rough. "A weak wolf, a wolfless girl, all the same to him." He looked at her and his face had gone very hard and very certain. "But not this time. Not you. Not those boys. I won't let it happen twice." And she believed him, down to the bone. There was something else in his face too that night. Something working behind the gold of his eyes when he looked at her, a question he hadn't yet let himself ask. She was too tired to catch it. She only saw that when he thought she wasn't looking, he watched her the way a man watches a door. He's almost sure he's walked through before. "Get some sleep," he said. "Long walk tomorrow." She was just drifting under when the first howl split the night. Her eyes snapped open. Corvin was already on his feet. "Behind that tree," he said. "Take the pups. Take the pack. Stay down and stay quiet." She grabbed both squirming boys and dove for cover, and through the trees she could see them coming, shadows moving fast. Tracker wolves 4 at least, and guards behind them, torches, swords. Corvin met the first wolf before it reached the camp. The fight was brutal and it was fast, and Elspeth pressed the twins to her chest and shut her eyes to the worst of it. Until one guard broke through the line, coming straight for her, and she didn't think she kicked the dying embers of the fire up into his face. The coals scattered and he screamed, clawing at his eyes, and Corvin was on him in an instant. And then the others were fleeing, crashing back into the dark. And then Corvin made a sound. Low. Wrong. A groan pulled up from somewhere deep, and it put ice straight through her. She scrambled out from behind the tree. He'd gone to his knees. One hand pressed hard to his side, and between his fingers the blood came dark, and it came fast, too much. "Corvin," her voice climbed. "It's not why isn't it healing poison," through his teeth. "Blade was poisoned. What do we do?" He tried to stand, failed, tried again, swaying. There'll be more. They heard the fight. We move. Now. You need to rest. We move. Iron in it. Now. She stared at him. At the blood. At the gray creeping into his face. All right, she said. And it came out steadier than she felt. Steadier than she had any right to feel. We move. But you lean on me. You lean on me the whole way. He gripped her thin shoulder, levered himself up, swayed hard, and she braced and took his weight, this huge broken man half fallen against a wolfless child, and together, one agonizing step at a time, they stumbled forward into the dark. The terrain flattened at last, rocky, sparse, blessedly clear after weeks of trees, and Elspeth looked up and she saw it, spread across the wide valley below a camp. Dozens of canvas tents, cook fires trailing black smoke into a gray sky. Figures moving between the structures with purpose, with weapons, with the ordered urgency of an army. Corvin, she whispered. The words split down the middle. We're here. We made it. He lifted his head with what looked like the last of his strength, and they pushed forward, down into the valley, one step then another, and no one noticed them at first. Soldiers sharpening blades, smiths hammering at forges, scouts reporting in. A filthy girl half carrying a bleeding man, two wolf pups pressed to her side and not one head turning. Please, she called out. Her voice gave. Please, someone help. A few faces turned and looked away. Please. Everything she had left. Every scrap. And more heads turned. People began to notice. This child, this bleeding man, these impossible pups. And that was when Corvin's legs went out entirely. He dropped and his weight took her with him and they hit the rocky ground together and he didn't move, didn't make a sound. And suddenly people were running. Soldiers, camp workers, a woman in a healer's robe's gray-streaked hair, sharp eyes dropping to her knees beside Corvin and turning him onto his back. What happened, child? The words tumbled out. We were attacked, the king's men. Corvin fought them off, but one of the blades was poisoned. The woman pulled aside his blood-soaked shirt, and her mouth went thin. I have to find the queen, Elspeth said. The princes they need. She could barely stand. Someone fetch her majesty. Fetch the queen, the healer called over her shoulder. And a soldier sprinted off. She looked back. What's your name, girl? Elspeth. I'm Pandra. Her hands were already working. I'm going to help your friend. You hear me? I'm going to try. Soldiers came with a stretcher and lifted Corvin onto it gentle as they could. His eyes were shut, his face ashen, but his chest still rose, still fell. Pandra glanced down at the pups pressed to Elspeth's legs and something flickered over her face. Unusual, she murmured, to shift so young. Elspeth pulled them closer. They're special. And before Pandra could answer, a woman's voice cut clean through the whole gathered crowd, low and powerful, and it stopped every soldier in his tracks. What is the meaning of this? The crowd parted, and the queen came through. Elspeth knew her at once. She couldn't have said how. Tall and regal, beautiful, even in worn fighting leathers, dark hair pulled back in a hard braid, and her eyes swept the scene, the bleeding man, the ragged girl, and then dropped. To the pups. And everything in her face fell apart. Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes brimmed, and then she was running and she dropped to her knees in the dirt and gathered both wolf pups into her arms. My babies, she sobbed. My babies. You came back to me. You came back. And she held them, and she wept, her whole body shaking, and the pups pressed close and nuzzled into her neck, and their tails moved slow, uncertain, then faster, because they knew. Down in the blood and the bone they knew. This was their mother's scent. This was the thing they'd been screaming for a year and more. The whole camp had gone silent. The queen lifted her head. Her voice came thick. Who, she said, who brought them back to me? And she looked up, and her gaze found Elspeth, and the color drained from Queen Iseline's face like water from a cracked jar. You, she breathed, and cold fear went down Elspeth's spine because she'd seen that look once before, hadn't she? On a man in a nursery doorway. A royal face changing like that, and it had ended with a shattered cradle and a word she still couldn't unhear. They were lost without you. Elspeth said, fast pleading. I only tried to keep them safe. I'm sorry if I did something wrong, I'm so sorry. But the queen crossed to her and took Elspeth's dirty face in both her warm and shaking hands. You brought my sons back to me, Iseline said, and the words trembled apart. You brought them home. I tried, Elspeth managed. And up close she could see the queen's hands were shaking, could see the way her eyes searched Elspeth's face with an intensity that was almost hunger, almost grief. And then the queen pulled her into her arms, and Elspeth went stiff with the shock of it, because no one held her like this. No one had ever held her like this with the same desperate relief she'd just given her own children. Thank you, Iseline whispered into her hair. Thank you, thank you. When they parted, the queen kept both hands on Elspeth's face. What is your name, child? Elspeth. And the queen flinched, as if the name were a blow. Elspeth, she repeated, softer. How old are you? 12. Iseline's eyes fell shut, and when they opened, they were swimming, and she pulled the girl close again and pressed a kiss to her forehead, and Elspeth understood none of it. None of it at all. Your Majesty, Pandra's voice urgent from the stretcher. The wounded man. He has to come to the tent. Now. The queen pulled back but kept one hand firm on Elspeth's shoulder. Who is he, Corvin? Elspeth's throat closed on the name. He helped us. He protected us. He got hurt because of us. Something fierce moved through Iseline's face. Take him to my own healer, she commanded. Use whatever you need, whatever it costs. I want that man to live. And Pandra nodded and followed the stretcher away. Elspeth healed first, slept first, ate first, though she couldn't recall the last time she had. And Corvin's recovery was slow, but it came. She visited him every day. At first, she came alone, slipping into the healing tent to sit by his cot and tell him small, foolish stories about the pups, how Doran had learned to open a supply chest, how Kaelin had lost a war with a boot. But as the days stretched on, she noticed she wasn't always his only visitor. Because one evening she came in and found the queen already there. Iseline sat at Corvin's bedside, sleeves rolled to the elbow, unwinding the bandage from his ribs with a care that was not, Elspeth thought, entirely a healer's care. Corvin was watching the queen's face, and on his own was an expression Elspeth had never once seen him wear. You're terrible at following orders, he said. Rough, teasing. Aren't you? Iseline said something too low to hear, and Corvin laughed, and the laugh pulled at his wound and made him wince. Pretty sure I told you to stop fussing, he said, and let the healers do their work. And I'm pretty sure I told you to stop being so stubborn. He caught her wrist. Gentle. I'm serious, Your Highness. You don't need to do this. I want to. And their eyes met, and held, and the air between them went warm and full and quiet, and Elspeth felt suddenly like a girl standing in a doorway where she didn't belong. A small smile tugged at her mouth, and she slipped back out into the evening and left the two of them to it. But the truth of who she was couldn't wait forever. Because that same night she couldn't sleep, and she went looking for Corvin again and came up soft to the healing tent and stopped because voices were coming from inside. Low, serious, and her own name in the middle of them. So she stood very still in the dark, and she listened. She brought your pups back, Corvin was saying. Fine. Wonderful. I'm happy for you, truly. But now what? What happens to her? I have no intention of sending her back to the king, Iseline said, if that's your worry. Good. Glad to hear it. A pause. But there's a whole world between not sending a child to her death and actually caring for one. She's 12. She's been through hell. She needs somebody. She will be well cared for. That's not... And his voice caught, then steadied. Look, I'll take her. I mean it. I'll raise her myself. Somebody has to, and it might as well be a man who already... He stopped. Might as well be me. And Elspeth's hand flew to her mouth in the dark. Because he wanted her. Corvin wanted to keep her. And there was a long silence inside the tent. Long enough that she almost couldn't bear it. That is a great kindness, Iseline said at last, and her voice was strange, tight. Truly, but it's one I cannot accept. Why? Because Elspeth will stay here, with me. Did you even ask her? Because she is mine. And the world tilted sideways. What? Corvin said. Elspeth is my daughter. Elspeth's back hit the canvas wall. Her legs stopped holding her up. You said my scent reminded you of someone, Iselin said quietly, and now Elspeth could hear the tears in it. It reminded you of her, because she is mine, my firstborn. King Valor's firstborn child and his heir, the one he rejected the moment he learned she couldn't shift. And inside the tent, Corvin said something low and stunned, and outside it Elspeth slid down the wall and sat in the cold grass and could not breathe. The king. The man in the nursery doorway. The man she'd built a whole self around. The man she'd sworn for 7 years had once carried her out of a garden and called her worth saving. Her father. When she was born without a wolf. Iselin went on, and the words were breaking now all the way through. It changed nothing for me, nothing. She was beautiful, she was mine. But Valor, the name came out bitten in half. Valor was afraid. There is an old story in his line, a prophecy, that a child born without a wolf would be the ending of his reign. And he believed it. He looked at his own daughter, our daughter, and all he saw was the end of himself. A silence. I wanted her dead. He called her defective, a curse, and I begged. I got down on my knees to my own husband and begged for her life. And I made him a bargain. I said I would give him a true heir, a perfect one, that I'd keep trying however long it took, but only if he let her live. And he agreed, Corvin said. Barely. He agreed, but to keep me obedient he took her from me. Her voice went to nothing. My baby. I was not allowed to hold her, not to nurse her, not even to see her, not until I gave him his proper heir. I was a prisoner in my own palace for 12 years, Corvin. 12 years of loss of grief of one failed pregnancy after another, and all the while my daughter lived 3 floors below me, and I was not permitted to speak one word to her. Outside in the dark. Elspeth pressed both hands to her mouth and wept without sound. 12 years. The garden, the kitchen, the cupboard, the whole of her life, and 3 floors up a mother. And when the twins were born, Iselin said, when I'd finally given him everything he demanded, he still would not let me have her. And that was when I understood. He never meant to keep his word. My Elspeth was not safe. None of my children were safe. So I tried to run, with all 3 of them, and I was caught. She drew a breath that shook. He had me arrested for treason, meant to execute me in front of the whole court. And the only reason I stand here now is that people loyal to me, servants, women, no one ever looks at twice, got me out. Orsolya was one of them. Do you understand? Orsolya has been mine all along. And at that name, Elspeth's heart lurched in her chest. I fled to my own people, my old pack in the north. And I raised an army and I declared war. Not for the throne. I don't give one damn for the throne. But for my children. For all 3 of them. Silence in the tent. And Elspeth outside pushed herself up on legs that didn't want to work and turned to run nowhere, just away, just somewhere she could hold all of this without it crushing her, and made it 3 steps before a hand caught her shoulder. Gentle. Elspeth. She turned. Iselin stood there in the dark, tears running silver down her face. Is it true? Elspeth whispered, and her mother nodded. And Elspeth broke. Great heaving sobs tearing up out of a place locked shut her whole life, and she flung herself forward, and the queen caught her and held her, and they stood there in the cold and wept for the 12 years stolen, for the cruelty endured for the mother, 3 floors away, and the daughter who never knew, for Orsolya standing in a kitchen with a knife. For everything that had been taken, but also impossibly against everything for this. For finding each other again. There was one more truth to come, and it came the next day in the healing tent, and it came from Corvin. He was sitting up now, stronger, the gray gone out of his face. And when Elspeth ducked in to see him, he was quiet a moment, studying her, the way he'd studied her that first night in the forest, like a man reading a page he was almost sure he'd read before. Come here, kid, he said. Sit. I have to tell you something, and I've only just let myself be sure of it. She sat. 13 years back, Corvin said slowly. I was still the king's man. God help me. And one night he called 3 of us to a chamber, and there was a newborn in it. A little girl, hours old. His jaw tightened. And he gave us an order. Take her out past the walls, he said. Leave her in the woods. She's wolfless. She's a curse on my line." Elspeth had gone very still. "The other two would have done it," Corvin said. "One of them reached for the basket. And I don't know what happened in me. I'd followed that man into wars. Done things I don't say out loud. But I looked at that baby, and something just refused. So I took her myself, said I'd handle it." He let out a slow breath. "But I couldn't leave her in the cold. Couldn't. So I carried her back in through the servants' gate and left her with the kitchen women, and I told them to raise her as an orphan and never say where she came from. And then I ran. Before he could learn I'd disobeyed him." The tent was very quiet. "I carried you back once," Corvin said, and his rough voice had gone almost soft. "Years later, I heard tell of a little wolfless girl who got lost in the palace gardens, and a man carried her home. That was me too, Elspeth. I came back now and again over the years, to make sure the child I'd saved was still breathing. That once in the garden, that was me." And the whole shape of Elspeth's life turned over in the space of a breath. Because it had never been the king. Not in the garden. Not ever. The golden man she'd built her whole self around the proof she clung to that she was worth saving, that had been this scarred, weary, wonderful stranger all along. The one who'd refused an order for her before she had a name. The one who'd walked her 3 days north without ever once being asked to stay. "It was always you," she whispered. "It was always you," Corvin agreed. And she put her face against his shoulder, and he wrapped one big scarred arm around her, and neither of them said anything for a long while, because some things are too large for words to carry. Now there was one last cruelty to undo, because Pandra found it. Examining Elspeth as the queen, had asked a mother's thoroughness, now wanting to know her child was whole. The healer went very still with her hands at the base of Elspeth's neck. "Your Majesty," she said slowly, "come here. Feel this." And Iselin came, and Pandra guided the queen's fingers to the place, and the queen's breath stopped. "This girl is not wolfless," Pandra said. "There is a wolf in her, I would swear it on my life. But it's been," she reached for the word, "bound, sealed, chained down from the time she was a newborn. Someone did this to her, on purpose." And the tent went cold. Because they all knew who. There was only one man in the world who had held Elspeth as a newborn and wished her gone. Only one man frightened enough of a prophecy to reach into his own daughter and cage the thing he feared to make her the very wolfless child the story warned him of, to make his nightmare true with his own 2 hands. Elspeth sat there and something moved in her that had no name, because her whole life she'd believed she was empty, broken, missing the one thing that made a person, and it had never been true. "So I had a wolf," she whispered, "all along." "You did," her mother said. And here, right here, is the thing Elspeth would carry the rest of her days. Because she looked around that tent. At Corvin, who'd refused an order and bled half to death for her when she was nothing but a wolfless kitchen girl. At Orzolia, somewhere behind enemy lines, who'd loved her when she had nothing to give back. At the twins who'd chosen her out of every soul in the palace. At her mother who'd gone to war for a daughter she wasn't even allowed to touch. All of them had loved her, fought for her, nearly died for her, while she was still, as far as any of them knew, wolfless. The wolf hadn't made her worth saving. She'd been worth saving the whole time. The wolf was only a thing that had been stolen from her, and stealing it had never once made her less. And that was the truth the king had never understood and never would. The war came in the end, the way she'd known it must. King Valor would not surrender his heirs, and he would not surrender the daughter who was living proof of what he'd done. So his forces came north, and Iselin's army met them on the plain below the foothills. And Elspeth was not supposed to be there. She was meant to be safe in the rear with the twins, with the healers, a dozen guards between her and the fighting. Which is exactly where she was until the line broke. Until a company of the king's wolves punched through and came howling toward the tents, toward the children, toward Kaelin and Doran, who took one look at the wolves bearing down and shifted small and furious and put their tiny bodies between the enemy and their sister. And Elspeth did not think. She threw herself forward, between her baby brothers and a wall of teeth, A wolfless girl with nothing to fight with and everything to lose, and she flung her arms wide and she stood there and she screamed one word. No. And something broke. Not a cradle this time. Something inside her. The thing chained down for 12 long years, the wolf her own father had caged it, heard her and it woke and it tore free all at once. Light poured out of her and bone reshaped, and where a starving girl had stood there, was suddenly a wolf young and pale and blazing planted between her brothers and the dark. The king's wolves faltered, because they knew. Every wolf on that field knew the way wolves know things what they were looking at. The wolfless princess, the impossible child, the end of the prophecy standing on 4 legs at last, in exactly the place the king had spent 12 years trying to make sure she'd never be. And across the field Valor saw her, and his face Elspeth would remember his face was not rage this time, it was terror. Because the thing he'd feared his whole life had just risen up out of the daughter he'd tried to erase, and every cruelty he'd committed to prevent it had carried him here. To this. To the exact ending he'd dreaded. He'd made it true himself, every step of the way. There was no great final duel. That's not how it ended. Because the moment his own wolves understood what he'd done, that their king had chained a newborn, cast out his firstborn, made war on his own children, out of fear of a story, the heart went out of them. One by one they stopped, sat, lowered their heads. A wolf will not follow a leader whose fear has made him a coward, and Valor's fear had been the whole truth of him all along. His pack turned from him on that field, left him standing alone, alone the way he'd left everyone he ever decided was worthless. And there is a kind of justice in that, the oldest kind, and it needed no blade at all. They found Orsolia in the king's dungeon when the palace fell. Thinner, grayer, but alive, because a woman that's stubborn does not die easily. And when Elspeth came running down those steps, the old woman opened her arms and said only, "There's my girl." And Elspeth fell into them, and did not let go for a long, long time. The season turned before Elspeth's family was whole again. Corvin healed slow, but he healed stubborn as ever. And more often now Elspeth would find him and Whistling in quiet corners, heads bent close, her mother's hand resting easy on his arm, and she'd smile and leave them their peace. The twins shifted back to boys a week after the fighting ended. She woke one morning to find 2 small children curled against her instead of 2 pups, and she nearly wept with the relief of it. They switched back and forth constantly now, as if making up for lost time, and they followed her everywhere. Because she was their sister. Because she'd been their sister all along, and their small hearts had known it before anyone's head did. One evening near the end of that first good season, they were all together on a blanket in the grass. Kaelin sprawled in Corvin's lap, Doran curled in his mother's, Elspeth on her back in the middle of them, watching the sky go gold to pink to deep and endless purple. "They love you," Iseline said, looking at the boys. "They trusted you when they couldn't trust anyone in the world." "Because I smelled like you," Elspeth said, and her throat went tight. "No." Her mother reached over and brushed the hair from her face, gentle, the way she'd been forbidden to for 12 stolen years. "Because you are their sister, and because you are the kind of person a frightened child knows to reach for in the dark." The fire crackled, sparks spiraled up toward the first stars, and Elspeth lay there and looked at them. Her fierce, small, impossible family, made of every person the world had thrown away. And she thought about a girl on a straw mat in a cupboard that wasn't a room, who used to whisper in the dark. That one day, someone would see what she was worth. That girl had gotten one thing wrong. She'd thought she had to become something first. Earn it, prove it, grow a wolf, win a king, be chosen. But she'd been worth it the whole time. From the very beginning. Wolfless in a kitchen greased down her front, laughed at by children, she had been worth every ounce of the love that finally found its way to her. She just hadn't known it yet. Tomorrow there would be a kingdom to rebuild, wounds to tend, a long road still ahead of them all. But tonight, under that wide and wheeling sky, they were only a family. Only and everything a family. And that was more than enough.